Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Russian accent. This is the channel where all opinions are delivered with only one promise. The person who is talking is going to be talking with a Russian accent. Okay. Now we're going to be talking about Ukraine-Russian war. As everybody knows, this war has three main components, three main parties. One of the parties is the Russian Federation. The other one is the state of Ukraine, and the third one is the collective West. In this particular segment, hopefully I'm gonna just make two videos. In this first video, I'm gonna talk about the conflict between the Russian Federation and the collective West. The conflict between the Russian Federation and the state of Ukraine, I'm gonna be talking in the second video. All right, let's see. So, how this conflict came about between these two parties. Everybody, of course, understands the whole long history of the Cold War. I'm not going to repeat that. Now, everybody also knows the Cold War was effectively ended in the late 80s through the efforts of the American administration led by Reagan and then Bush Sr., while the Soviet administration was led by Gorbachev. Okay. So when the Soviet Union fell apart in 1991, at the end of 1991, uh, effectively there was no conflict any longer between these two parties. And when I'm talking collective West, of course, I'm mostly meaning the United States of America, although of course the European Union is obviously the part of it. But Washington D.C., that's where the dog is buried, so to speak. Anyway, so there was no conflict. There was complete absence of conflict, right? So why do we have a conflict today, but we didn't have a conflict in 1991, 1992? Okay, well, I will say the first thing. There's many different components as to why it came about, but I would say from the purely sort of perspective of the former Soviet citizens. Now, I left Soviet Ukraine, which was no longer Soviet Ukraine in 1992, was already sovereign state. So I haven't lived through the 90s really in the former Soviet Union, but I know a lot about it, and I visited a lot, not so much throughout the 90s, but afterwards. But I'm well aware of what happened in the 90s. What happened in the 90s is that the Soviet republics, former Soviet republics, they became the independent states that they took the prescription of their Western so-called democracies, right, the American and Western prescription to liberalize their economies, liberalize to the point where economies became completely uh, models of complete wild pillaging, wild capitalism, wild degradation of living standards. It was a complete economic collapse in the 90s. Okay, and that not only happened in Russia, it happened just about in all Soviet republics, including Ukraine. So all of these places now, some of them even experienced very severe military conflicts, such as Tajikistan, for example. But we're not talking about that aspect of it. We're mostly talking about the relationship between Ukraine, Russia, and so forth. So there was no conflict as such, but the economy was in shambles. The economy completely degraded. The living standards of the Soviet citizens which were already not particularly high relative to the Western standards, one could say. And so that was the first big disillusionment with the Western imposition of Western policies on the people of these regions. The people first saw firsthand that some prescriptions, as per the Western experts, didn't actually work at all. In fact, they completely destroyed their lives. So there was one negative aspect that actually took place. And of course, from the perspective of the Russian Federation, there was also continuous uh, issues and strife and military conflicts, such as one in Chechnya and so forth. And of course, America, and although was technically a friend of sort of Russian Federation at that point, American interests were clearly behind some of the actions taken by the rebel separatists and so forth. So that kind of marred the relationship a little bit to begin with. But that was not the main issue. The main issue was expansion of NATO. Now, in 1999, during the unification of Germany had to take place with the absence of the Soviet troops on the German soil. Gorbachev uh, did exactly that to facilitate German reunification in 1999. He pulled the troops from Germany. In response, his Western counterparts gave him verbal assurances, which had been confirmed on multiple occasions, that NATO will not expand past East Germany. In fact, not just past German border. And and of course, the NATO expansion continued. Now, when people are saying that the people of the countries that entered NATO somehow had the expressing the will of the people, and they had the full right to enter the NATO. That's a very naive point of view. NATO is a military alliance, and when anybody says it's a defensive alliance, it's a complete obviously it's a complete lie. It's the war in Yugoslavia showed war in Libya and so forth. It's not a defensive alliance. And also it's a private club. And the private club, who makes a decision to admit anybody in the private club? Not the one who wants to enter, but the one who is actually running the private club, right? So to say that that was just the will of the people, let's say Poland or Czech Republic, to enter NATO is complete nonsense. It was obviously part of the strategy. So in 1997, the first NATO expansion happens. Now, at that time, the president of the Russian Federation was Yeltsin, who was effectively an American resident in Moscow. Okay, he was well supported by the Americans during his second election campaigns. He was financed, and of course, he was very well rehearsed in terms of regurgitating talking points of the West. And yet, even Yeltsin protested when it came to the issue of NATO expansion. Even Yeltsin protested. I mean, it tells you so much about the whole dynamic of the situation. So as you see, the pressure is not coming from Russia towards the West. It comes in opposite direction. The West pressures Russia. The West impose economic policies. They devastate Russia. The West undertakes NATO expansion. Russia protests. In 1997, Zbigniew Brzezinski, the former Secretary of State under Carter, wrote a book famous book in which he described. I'll put the book in the comments anyway. So he described how Russia actually is too big over over country, and it's not very convenient for the American interests. And now Russia is much better to be dismantled in parts. Okay, so effectively he outlined ongoing policy towards Russia. In other words, despite all the nice and friendly words, there was nothing friendly about it, right? They wanted to dismantle it because they don't want to see a big, powerful state potentially. At that time, Russia was very weak, but they don't want to see that as impediment to any kind of interest. So, of course, it's much easier to deal with smaller states. And so that was the thrust of it. Now, roll forward, you got year 2000. Putin comes to be president of Russia. Clinton comes to Moscow. They have a really nice conversation, and Putin suggests, "Hey, why don't you take me into NATO?" And of course, Clinton declined. And obviously, the reason is because NATO is a military-industrial alliance. I mean, they need an enemy. In an absence of enemy, it's not possible to raise funds or to find public support or anything. Why are you having the military alliance now? When you had the military alliance against the communist countries of Europe, well, that's fine, but now they don't exist anymore. So what's your military alliance exactly for? So they had to be. So they sort of, again, the pressure comes from the West. They're trying to make an enemy, even if that one does not exist. Okay, roll September 9/11. Okay, during 9/11, I think Putin was the first one on record of the foreign leaders to call Bush and told him about full support of Russia in fighting terrorism and so forth, right? Of course, Bush seemed to have appreciated it, but that was just maybe a personal gesture. In terms of policy, nothing really changed. In 2002, okay, so what happened in 2002? In 2002, Americans unilaterally withdrew from the anti ballistic missile treaty. And what did they cite as a threat? This is very interesting. They cited the threat from rogue states and terrorists. I mean, Iran or something like that, which is complete nonsense. Obviously, Iran, particularly at that time, was very weak. I mean, you're not talking about very strong state, and of course, the Western powers had all the firepower they needed. So obviously, and of course, as a result of this abandonment of this treaty, I mean, America started installing all sorts of interesting rocket installations in Germany and Czech Republic and so forth. And directly related to, of course, the question is why are you installing, why are you undertaking this installation in these locations if your concern is Iran? I mean, why don't you do it in, I don't know, Bulgaria or something like that, right? But of course, they were not doing it there. And the reason being, obviously, that Russia had to be defined as an enemy. So that was a problem. Of course, the Russians protested as always, right? Now, this time under Putin. Okay, so the Putin uh, is a boogeyman of the East, so not Yeltsin anymore. Okay, and then in 2002, at the same time, there was also another round of NATO expansion. Now, that particular round included former Soviet states in the Baltics. Now you have really big problem all of a sudden. So not now. Again, like pressure is going on in one direction. There's no pressure from the other end. Other end is trying to respond. They don't know how to respond. Right? They don't have any means to respond. They don't want to respond. They don't have uh, perhaps public support or other capacities to do so. Okay. So then we arrive at, and it continues, right? And then we arrive at year 2008 when during Bucharest in Bucharest NATO summit, President Bush decided to announce the candidacy of Ukraine and Georgia, candidacies of Ukraine and Georgia into NATO. I mean, that's great. The funniest bit that a lot of the American officials had been always very cautious. I mean, behind the scenes, very cautious about it. And there was this one particular memo that was directed at Condoleezza Rice that was later leaked to WikiLeaks that basically said that acceptance of Ukraine into NATO is the red line for the Russians. In other words, this is a point of pressure where Russians could actually provide a strong response. This is type of danger that all this NATO expansion and other policies were leading to. Americans knew perfectly well what they were doing. They were literally trying to poke the bear. They knew that. There was no mistake about it. There's nothing to do about any will of the people or anything like that. It was the desire to create an enemy and to agitate the enemy to such a point as to create much bigger platform for, let's say, weapons expansion, for new wars, for more money, and so forth. Typical dynamic of the military-industrial complex. Okay, of course, the Russians protested once again. There was a lot of talk even in the European Union how that should not be happening, but regardless, the thing was put on the table. Now, Georgians, so the Ukraine, remember it was the candidacy of Ukraine and Georgia. Georgians didn't wait too long at all. Georgians decided to, well, we'll take matter our own hands, and they just attacked the South Ossetia, which, well, used to be part of the Georgian Soviet Republic, but had been separate since 1991 on the basis of the ethnic conflict. And so the Georgians attacked, the Russians responded, and then Georgia was defeated effectively and assigned surrender, more or less. Now, in the Western propaganda, it's always portrayed as if Russia attacked Georgia, which is completely the reverse of the real facts. Now, if you want to actually understand how flagrant the violation was, even the European Union own report on that war stated that Georgia started the hostilities. Okay, so Georgians didn't want to wait; they were goaded into it, particularly by the Senator McCain and so forth. And they all went on, and they decided that maybe we'll force the hand, maybe because by doing so we'll have much faster and quicker support from NATO. Support did not come. War ended quickly, and Georgia suffered defeat. That's it. Now, uh, by that time, by the end of the Bush administration, the relationship between the Russian Federation and the U.S. and NATO deteriorated to such a point that it was like they were no longer talking or anything like that. And then came sort of this reset when Clinton was Secretary of State, between Clinton and Medvedev when he was the president. But this reset came to nothing, really. It was just a propaganda stunt because American and NATO interests, the Western interests, continue to interfere, particularly in the internal affairs of Ukraine. Okay, so when we had this Maidan uprising in 2013-14, during that uprising, the Western powers, instead of trying to negotiate, let's say, negotiate a solution between the sitting president and the insurrectionists, rebels, revolutionaries, however you want to call them, the opposition, right? Instead of doing that, they were literally trying to go on the rebels to continue their attacks and continue the opposition, continue their attacks on the current administration then, in order to take over the power structures, right? So during the uprising, you had people they erected the stage right in the middle of Kiev. Now, most of this uprising, although there were a lot of violence towards the end, most of it was not so violent, but the demonstrations went on day and night, and they were staged right in the middle of Kiev, and there was a stage where all sorts of people came and gave talks to the revolutionaries, encouraging them. So what role did the United States play, or the West? Well, Canadian Minister of Foreign Affairs there, under our beloved Prime Minister Harper, went and encouraged the rebels right there from the stage, effectively to achieve the revolutionary goals. I mean, this is crazy. This is direct interference into affairs of the state, right? Same with American politicians such as Lindsey Graham or John McCain. They all went on the stage and they encouraged the rebels to take over the power. Now, the Subsecretary of State Victoria Nuland, her telephone conversation was intercepted with the American ambassador, where she outlined who was going to be in the parliament and who was not going to be in the parliament. It was very severe interference. I mean, obviously very open. Okay, and yet, so imagine, so now you have this year, so you have this years of increasing pressure, right? You have NATO expansion 97, 2002, 2008. You have the Georgian War 2008. You have the abandonment of all sorts of treaties, including this mid-range nuclear treaty, right? In 2002, you have continuing pressure. You have these people deliberately, clearly supporting and abetting, because part of that support, right, had to do with public affairs, public so-called propaganda, let's say, right? And so the Western public was completely on, was made to be completely on the side of the opposition without even knowing why they were on their side, right? So of course that whole series of events culminated in a coup, okay? And the coup took place day after opposition and the sitting president signed an agreement which was guaranteed by the European Union about settling the conflict. So imagine one day they got together in the room, they signed an agreement which is guaranteed by the European Union, de facto by the collective West. And then the next day, they coup the president and he flees the country. And so what happens next? Instead of the condemnation from the European Union for not holding up the agreement, the European Union recognizes and congratulates new Ukrainian parliament. I mean, the government, which was illegal. Okay. And then you have, so at the same time, the two agreements were openly and completely destroyed. One was the Budapest Nuclear Non-Proliferation Agreement, where when Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in 1994, the Western powers and Russia gave it the guarantee of no interference in the Ukrainian affairs. So the first thing that happens that the West interferes in Ukrainian affairs in the most gross manner, and then they actually go completely 180 on the agreement that just guaranteed regarding the opposition and the current president, and they welcome the new Ukrainian government, the legal government, into power. Same with the United States, the same European Union, all Western countries did the exact same thing. So this is quite terrible, in my opinion. That's what happened. So up to this point, Russia, as far as we know, officially had done nothing illegal with respect to any of it. But that's when the first time when Russia starts committing illegalities. But only then, right? So you're talking about all those things that took place throughout the years. Only in 2014, Russia begins committing illegalities. What will Russia do? Russia seizes Crimea, and Russia starts aiding and abetting the separatists, the counter rebels, if you wish, in eastern Ukraine. Okay. Now, with respect to seizing of Crimea, on the one hand, obviously Russia did seize Crimea, and that from that perspective, so the Ukrainian sovereignty, it's also interference, and obviously it's illegal. On the other hand, the referendum that the Russia staged um, showed that majority of Crimeans wanted to be part of Russian Federation. Now, you could say, well, the referendum was a sham, right? That's what it's portrayed in Western media and propaganda. It said, well, it was at the point of a gun. There was no other choice. People just went and did. Now, it's not actually not true, but how you can confirm that was not true is very simple, because it was an American. Sorry, I apologize. The German public opinion poll organization. They did the poll, nothing to do with the Russians. They just start calling up people in Crimea and taking their opinion. Okay, a year later after that, and lo and behold, their research confirmed that the results of Crimean referendum were just about right. Okay, so just on that aspect. Now, I'm not saying it was not illegal for Russia to seize it, but it was legal for people of Crimea to express their will as far as joining Russia. Okay, we just leave it at that. As far as the Russian East the support for the Eastern Ukraine, obviously that was a counter pressure after all those things that took place in Kiev and everywhere else, right? That was their effort. That was their response, right? And as soon as the pressure started building up and the separatists, the counter rebels, sort of start creating groups of resistance and so forth, right away Russia facilitated a drafting of the first agreement that could have settled the whole thing. Basically, they wanted to, and the agreement was presented to the Ukrainian side in April 2014, and it was presented with the purpose of saying, look, aside from the issue of Crimea, which you can further litigate, let's create such a structure in Ukraine that Western interference would be minimized through federalization of Ukraine, right? But what was it? What did Ukrainian government, illegal Ukrainian government, do at that time? Not only they said no, they sent tanks to Donetsk. Okay, now the first attack actually failed, and the reason being because the tank brigade that was sent to Donetsk was mostly comprised of people who lived not so far from Donetsk. So when they came in, who were fighting? We're fighting the same people as we are. So there was actually they just gave up and actually the rebels took over the tank brigade. I think some of them also switched sides. Other perhaps returned to their home region. But then they sent, but then the director of CIA and other American officials went to Kiev and basically told Kiev, look, you want support, you have to start the war. You have to send the brigades. You have to take control. And that's exactly what happened in 2014. So don't make any mistake about it. Yes, Russia undertook illegal actions. Russia reacted for sure, but the pressure didn't come from Russia. The pressure came from the other side. And then when the first attempt to seize the uncontrolled territories by the illegal Kiev government resulted in their defeat, there was an agreement called Minsk One, right? And that was effectively an interim agreement, but that agreement that paved the way for the same idea of federalization of Ukraine that took place in April 2014. Now, Minsk One took place in the fall of 2014. But what happened next? Well, of course, that agreement was broken. So now you have a series of things that have been broken, right? You have promised to Gorbachev about the non-proliferation of NATO, non-expansion of NATO. You have say non-proliferation nuclear agreements torn up, right? Now you have the Budapest memorandum is torn up. Now you have the agreement with the opposition between Yanukovych and the opposition torn up. Now they tear up the Minsk one. Now they arrive at Minsk two after this another defeat in the winter of 2015. So Minsk two arrives in February 2015. If anybody ever read that agreement, has 13 points in it. Okay, in that particular agreement, they're absolutely clear which side had obligations of what they had to do. In other words, it all was all about legislative changes, about federalization of Ukraine, about balancing of power between East and West. And of course, that agreement again was signed by Western powers such as Germany and France. It was signed by Ukraine. It was signed by the rebels, and who did not hold their side of the bargain. So effectively, breaking that agreement as well. We know the answer to that. In fact, after the breakup of the war of 2022, Merkel and Hollande, I think they went on the record to say, "Oh, that agreement was just a cover for Ukraine to build up their armed forces." I mean, it's complete insanity. They're making agreements and they're breaking them. They're making agreements and they're breaking them. It's a consistent pattern that take place. Okay, so now that war that with the agreement Minsk II, since they were not holding to Minsk II, was never settled. The war continued on. It was a low grade war. It was not nothing like what you see in Ukraine today, obviously. But there was a war, right? And the war started with one part of Ukraine, the illegal Kiev government attacking the people who provided sort of a counter effort to the opposition that took power in Kiev. Okay, and as that continued, obviously the situation was not being resolved. And again, we know from all sorts of steps that Russia took now. Again, I'm not suggesting that Russia is some sort of angel here. They're also an illegal party. They're all criminal. As far as I'm concerned, the collective Western Russia, up to this point, acted illegally in one way or another. But of course, from the standpoint where it all came from, where the pressure came from, one has no doubt who actually instigated this conflict. Okay, Now, in 2021, Russia decided that they wanted to finally sort of settle this conflict. They were proposing, I mean, throughout this whole period, I mean, they were always calling for fulfillment of Minsk II and everything. But I think that it was stalled a little bit as a result of the Zelensky's election, because Zelensky was elected to bring peace to Ukraine. And this is the reason why he had overwhelming support. That's why he gets 73% of the vote. And of course, everybody understood. Everybody understood. Like, don't make any mistake about it. When he said he was going to bring peace, everybody understood that Zelensky was going to bring peace through fulfillment of Minsk II. Okay? When people telling you otherwise, it's nonsense. So, but of course, under the pressure from the Ukrainian nationalists, which I'll cover in the second video, Zelensky didn't do no such thing. So of course, this whole momentum that was sort of brought up to the point of some kind of hope in 2019, by the time you have 2021, the hope is really low. In fact, the war continues, and in fact, the language and rhetoric from Kiev increasing to such a point where you say, well, maybe they just want to have a full-scale attack again. Okay. Now, Russia at this point trying to undertake all sorts of different avenues to resolve the conflict. They approach Americans on numerous occasions. This is well documented. I'm not going to sort of go through particular details, but Americans refuse, effectively tell them to go away. And at this point, Russia decides to undertake the illegal invasion of Ukraine. Illegal invasion, criminal invasion of Ukraine. Okay, I'm not suggesting that Russia is somehow justified, despite all their grievances, is to provide such a response to Ukraine and the West not fulfilling their part of the bargain. Okay, so Russia undertakes the illegal invasion of Ukraine, and what happens next? Now, when people are presenting the Russian invasion of Ukraine as some sort of, ethnic cleansing campaign, Holocaust, terrorism, I think those terms probably are probably misapplied in this particular situation, because clearly Russian goals were always purely sort of geopolitical. Okay, now of course there's other things that come with it, but generally geopolitical goals. And so what happens? Russia attacks Ukraine in February 2022, illegally and criminally breaking international law, and they sit at the table of negotiations in Istanbul right away. And what happens in a few weeks? They have an agreement, effectively. An agreement that does exact same thing what Minsk was trying to do through the federalization of Ukraine. In other words, Crimea is out of the question. Crimea stays with Russia. Ukraine does not join NATO, and Russia takes control of Luhansk and Donetsk. Now, you could argue about what that looked like specifically, but nevertheless, the general outlines, right? So before, Ukraine, uh, in a sort of federalized form, was envisioned to keep Luhansk and Donetsk within their territory, yet at the same time they provided a counterbalance from the parliamentary point of view. Now Russia taking control of these territories completely, of course, that changes the equation, but generally, from the standpoint of de facto situation on the ground, nothing really changed. And that was Istanbul Agreement, okay? And Zelensky agreed to it. And they were gonna go, and they were apparently they were in the process of signing it or whatever. And then Boris Johnson, the great prime minister clown of United Kingdom, shows up in Kiev and tells Zelensky, no, 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 you cannot sign this agreement. If you want our money, our support, our arms, you have to fight. Okay? So, and that's exactly what happened. And that's exactly what happens to this day. So here you have complete intransigence. And I'm not talking about just one instance. I'm talking decades of intransigence and pressure on one side. And the other side deciding to fight by legal means. And you expect some sort of a settlement through military means? This is impossible, right? And so now we're in a situation where everybody understands that the only way to resolve it is to essentially resort to the same mechanisms that have been tried before, with the exception that they have to be actually adhered to. But that's not interest in the West. That's why you have uh, you have a situation of asymmetry, because the West only sends money and arms. The West is not losing people. Russia and Ukraine are losing people, and therefore West has no motivation whatsoever. That's another. This is actually, on the one hand, it's obviously criminality of the West, but on the other hand, it's the stupidity of Putin, because Putin himself put the Russian Federation in this situation, right? So now Russian Federation is losing people now, maybe not in the same extent as Ukraine, but they're losing people. They're of course being depleted from that standpoint of view, and there's a bit certain limit to that, I suppose. Whereas in the West, with the ability to freely print money at any point, I mean, they have no interest whatsoever to stop the conflict. In fact, American and Western leaders have opined so. I mean, Boris Johnson himself just recently went on TV and said, "Yeah, Ukraine is fighting good, valiant war, a proxy war for us." Okay, American leaders like Lindsey Graham said that we're very glad that we're depleting Russia, we're killing Russians, and with the hands of Ukrainians, but we're not losing a single American soldier. Well, they might have lost some, but they're not losing American personnel, right? And that's the main thing for the Americans. This war is fantastic for the West. And this is why I obviously blame the West for the complete cynical imposition on the Ukrainian people and using them as pawns in this proxy war. But I also blame Russia for getting into this war because they had to calculate that this was one of the eventualities that would happen. And that's why we're at the stalemate. Now, how this war could end, I'm going to discuss in the second part. Thank you very much for listening, and everybody has a nice day. Thank